Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to our CitySwitch, the role of business in sustainable food systems. Just let everyone kind of grab a seat, grab your coffee, settle in, and we'll get going. Okay, so I'll kick off. Thank you again for coming. Thanks for coming out on your Monday morning. It's really fabulous to have the CitySwitch network together again in person, and we have some guests here as well from our Sustainable Destination Partnership and our Better Buildings Partnership. I'm Emily, I'm the City of Sydney CitySwitch Program Manager, if I haven't met you before. And firstly, I'd like to thank our hosts, Marcus and the team at Clayton Utz for providing this beautiful boardroom. The view that we have, which is behind you, you'll get to check it out later, and the delicious vegetarian morning tea that we're going to enjoy. So we're super lucky to be here this morning. There's a couple of quick housekeeping items. As you would have heard, the event is being recorded and streamed live. But a note for all of you, the camera is focused on the speakers up here, so you can relax in the audience there. You're not being videoed. And also a reminder that COVID is still with us, so please adhere to the physical distancing and signage and use the hand sanitizers and the wipes available. Bathrooms, if you come out the door here and you go left is the men's, and on the right is the female bathrooms. Okay, so before I introduce our agenda this morning, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the original custodians of the local area we're on today, and I'd like to acknowledge their continued connection to country. I pay my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past, present and emerging. And I'm particularly conscious of the remarkable connection Indigenous peoples have to traditional and sustainable, rich and biodiverse food systems. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to secure a speaker for today, but we'll definitely make it happen for future events and CitySwitch resources. So our agenda for this morning, first up, keynote speaker Dr. Nick Rose, best known as Executive Director at Sustain, will be providing the foundation for our conversation about sustainable food systems and how businesses can play a role. Our fellow CitySwitch signatory and our host, Jonathan Cruz, Client Floor and Chef Manager at Clayton Utz, will talk us through their zero waste kitchen approach, including growing their own veg and worm farming upstairs, which is really impressive. And Deborah Sweetman, another CitySwitch signatory, Head of Corporate Responsibility for Australia and New Zealand at Swiss Re, is giving us an overview of their global strategy on sustainable gastronomy, which is a mouthful, but a brilliant name, and implementation in Australia. Darcy Small, where's Darcy? At the back there. Darcy Small from Kua will introduce their climate positive coffee service, and Ali Devlin, my co-host and CitySwitch colleague at North Sydney Council, will briefly talk on the New South Wales plastics ban and reusable options for catering. And then all of this will be followed by morning tea, so make sure you stick around for that. Okay. That's all from me. So first up, I would like to introduce Dr. Nick Rose. A little bit about Sustain. It's a registered charity and a network specialising in designing and building sustainable and healthy food systems. They give people, councils and organisations the tools they need to become empowered food citizens. So over to you, Nick. On the right.
On the right. Thank you. Fantastic. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with you in Sydney this morning on such a beautiful day and such a beautiful space and room, particularly coming from Melbourne, where it's been rather miserable and cold. So lovely to be up here in in the harbour city. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging we are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations persons who may be with us today in the room or watching online. And as Emily said, it's particularly important to remember First Nations culture, given that by some estimates, First Nations peoples in Australia have been here for 80 to 100,000 years managing the land sustainably. And it's important to remember that as I'm going to go through this presentation for the next 15 minutes to set the scene, talking about some of the big challenges we're facing in the food system in Australia and globally, and they are very big, as well as looking at some of the potential solutions, a framework for businesses to think about in working on this issue of sustainable food systems and the necessary transition we must make, and then looking particularly at urban agriculture, urban food, which is a strong focus of my organisation. So a little bit about me first. Funnily enough, I did begin my career as a corporate lawyer at Mallisons in the late 1980s. So being in a place like this, it's almost like coming full circle to be presenting on sustainable food systems. A major turning point in my journey from corporate law to sustainable food systems came in the early 2000s when I moved to Guatemala and worked for several years with Indigenous, women's rights and farmer organisations organising for access to land for community food security. Then I moved back to Australia in late 2006 and spent 8 years working with councils and communities on local food futures for the New South Wales Mid-North Coast. I was living up in Bellingen and Coffs Harbour whilst completing my PhD in food sovereignty at RMIT University. And then in 2014, I travelled to the United States, Canada and Argentina as a New South Wales Churchill Fellow. Some of you will no doubt be familiar with the Churchill Trust of Australia, to explore innovative models in urban agriculture and bring back lessons that could benefit the Australian community. So on this slide here are a few of the 150 leaders that I had the privilege of meeting, and they continue to inspire me to work for food systems change. Their achievements have been my guiding compass since founding Sustain in 2015. So our mission is to design and build better food systems. Our vision is of an Australia where no one is hungry or food insecure, where our diets enable us all to live full and happy lives in radiant health, and where our agricultural and land management practices restore our river catchments, soils and ecosystems to states of flourishing abundance. Sadly, we are very far from that vision today. To take just one indicator amongst so many, since colonisation in 1788 in Botany Bay, 100 species have become extinct and a further 1,900 are threatened with extinction. Land use change and agriculture are primary causes of this species loss. Massive land clearing in Queensland for cattle and fish kills in the Darling caused by over-irrigation are two recent examples in a long history of destructive land and water management practices. Australia is also a global leader in ecosystem degradation and greenhouse emissions. The rampant expansion of fast food chains in outer suburbs, combined with no controls on marketing or sports sponsorship, has contributed to a national doubling in obesity in the past decade alone. COVID-19, of course, has exposed major inequalities in our food system, resulting in a huge demand for food relief. So all these issues are interconnected and they're deeply entrenched. What we need to do is to develop a systemic response, and that means building capacity within communities, government and businesses to create momentum for system change. So here we are in 2022. The lasting impacts of COVID, which of course has not gone away, have combined with a severe inflationary spike, made significantly worse by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and in the Australian context, extreme flooding events, which you're familiar with here in Sydney, but of course they were impacting very heavily some of our major horticultural areas in southeast Queensland. In late March, head of the World Food Programme David Beasley said that the war in Ukraine has created, and I quote, a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe and will have a global impact beyond anything we've seen since World War II, his words. With Ukraine and Russia producing a combined 30% of the world's wheat, 20% of its corn and 80% of the sunflower oil, the World Bank's food commodity price index is now 80% higher than it was 2 years ago. Farm inputs at the same time have also risen sharply, with fertiliser prices more than 100% higher than this same time last year. Australia, of course, is not immune from any of these dynamics, with prices for fresh fruit and veg like tomatoes, carrots and apples up 40% this year. Price of bread, some cooking oils, beef sausages and baked beans have jumped 20 to 30%. So just looking at that in a little detail, this is from Daily Mail Australia. We can see how these input prices are playing out in the context of another essential food item, eggs. So the Daily Mail article from which this chart comes says, on the average egg farm in 2022, the cost of young laying hens increased 20%, fuel prices gone up 25%, feed grain costs 45%, and the cost of canola oil 141% per tonne, an increase. Drought, flooding, new government levies on farms and mice plagues have also contributed to farmers' rising costs, and several farmers are also carrying huge debt burdens as they prepare to transition from caged eggs to invest in free-range systems. So all these price rises together now with the interest rate rises mean that more Australians are experiencing food insecurity. In 2021, Foodbank Australia's hunger reports found that 1 in 6 Australians had not had enough to eat, and a shocking 1.2 million children across this country experienced hunger last year. Those numbers may well increase in 2022 with this conjuncture. So turning now to climate change, I handed out before a handout, which has got 2 sides to it. I haven't reproduced all of it in the interest of not sort of trying to cram too much text on the slide. But this particular infographic comes from the Climate Council, and what they've demonstrated is that the food system is very heavily impacted by extreme weather events, as well as prolonged droughts and rising temperatures. Wheat yields in Australia have already declined by 25% since 1990, and models suggest they're likely to drop much further if current trends continue and accelerate. On the other side of that handout is a different infographic. And what that demonstrates is that food and farming systems are not merely impacted by climate change. Our current heavily industrialised food system is very greenhouse gas emissions intensive and itself is a major driver of emissions. There is a better alternative. So on that infographic on the right-hand side, it talks through the potential and demonstrated impacts of regenerative agroecological farming systems. These are systems that sequester carbon in soils, restore habitats, and are much more resilient to climate change. So here's the framework, I think, that is worth thinking about from a business perspective in terms of how you integrate and implement some of these ideas and concepts and meet some of these challenges. So my contention to you is that we need to urgently transition from an unsustainable and unfair food system to a regenerative and equitable food system. That's a fundamental social challenge for us in Australia and globally. For governments and businesses, this means embracing, I say, the principles of the circular economy. So this infographic comes from a Dutch-based consultancy called Metabolic. Eva Gladek takes you through the 7 pillars of the circular economy, and that link that's down there in the bottom, it's well worth reading. So she says that in a circular economy, all materials should be used in such a way that they can be cycled indefinitely, just as theoretically they can be in nature. She says, as we continue to explore the implications of striving for a fully closed circular material cycle as a cornerstone of the economy, we ultimately encounter many other connections throughout the economic system that need to be arranged in a way which upholds broader human ideals. So she says, in the end, this exercise resulted in a set of 7 characteristics, the 7 pillars which describe the end state of the circular economy once it has been genuinely achieved. Now, she says these are idealised features that may never be possible to fully achieve in practice, but what they do provide is a specific set of targets that we can aim for as businesses and as societies. Now, each one of these can be characterised in greater quantitative detail, forming the basis for circularity indicators or KPIs in many different contexts. So here's where I guess the rubber hits the road from a business perspective in thinking how you would actually integrate these principles and put them into practice in your business, and I invite you to think about that. There's 4 I'd want to highlight from a food system perspective. First, biodiversity is supported and enhanced through human activity. Secondly, human society and culture are preserved. Think back to the First Nations heritage in Australia. Thirdly, the health and well-being of humans and other species are structurally supported. Think about the way our food system supports ill health rather than health and well-being at the moment. And fourthly, human activities maximise generation of societal value beyond the purely financial, aesthetic, ecological, emotional. These are all important principles. So in terms of what businesses can do, I've suggested there are at least 3 key actions that businesses can and are taking to implement some of these principles, and other speakers will shortly provide specific examples in the context of sustainable and ethical procurement and waste. So in the remaining time that I have, I want to speak briefly about some examples of urban agriculture, which I think illustrates that third principle of third application in terms of employee health and wellbeing. So metabolic notes, as I mentioned, the preservation of ecological diversity is one of the core sources of resilience for the biosphere and fundamental to a circular economy. So they give the example of Singapore in terms of indicators and KPIs, how a city-state has gone about implementing that pillar. It's an outstanding example of resilience, even in the third most densely populated country in the world. Why has that been able to be achieved? Because it has planning laws that are mandatory. They mandate green infrastructure, and that has seen it achieve 40% vegetation cover, and achieving a ranking as the second most sustainable city in the world, according to the Arcadis ranking. Now, in terms of Sydney, recent figures suggest that Sydney as a whole has a 23% canopy cover, but that drops to as low as 6% in the southwest hotspot of Rose Meadow. Urban agriculture plays a key role in Singapore's sustainability journey. The person in this photo is my colleague Bjorn Lowe, founder of Edible Garden City, a social enterprise that has created and maintained a network of dozens of edible gardens and citizen farms throughout the city, now employing 40 people. Businesses like Edible Garden City will have a key role to play in helping the Singapore Food Agency achieve its mandated local food security goal of 30% of nutritional requirements achieved from local sources by 2020. Think of that as a target. Back in Australia, urban agriculture is also getting attention. On the right is Pocket City Farm. Some of you may have been there, down the road in Camperdown, established in 2015. On the left is the Melbourne Food Hub, established at the Light Industrial Business Park run by the Melbourne Innovation Centre on public land on the site of a former rubbish dump in Alphington. As well as being places of fresh food production, sites like these offer educational and wellness opportunities for staff in city offices who can benefit from being out in the sun for a few hours, connecting with the soil, the plants themselves and each other. And there are opportunities for so many more such places. In June last year, we signed a 2-year MOU with the Melbourne Anglican Trust Corporation to establish the Oak Hill Food Justice Farm on the site of a disused vicarage in Preston, about 15 kilometres north of Melbourne CBD. In the space of 10 months, with support from philanthropy and the council, we've transformed an abandoned, overgrown and semi-vandalised site into a welcoming and flourishing urban farm and community garden. 40 local residents participate in weekly working bees. Volunteers from a local food security agency, Diverse, manage 6 beds to grow produce for their weekly food hampers. We've partnered with Preston Primary School, 5 minutes walk down Tyler Street, in a hands-on learning program that will see all 700 of their students come through the farm this year to work on a tomato harvest and passata making project. They're learning about soil fertility, the carbon cycle, pest and weed management, the use of cover crops, the benefits of composting and so much more. We've also in the last month launched a short-term paid internship program for young people experiencing barriers to education and employment. Within 3 days of announcing that, we had over 30 applicants for just 4 positions, and I'll just share with you now the motivations of 2 people who've applied. So this is actually an application on behalf of a young person at a supported learning centre who's transitioning out of that school at the end of term 2. The care worker says she's 21, she lives in Preston, her home is secured by the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. She has a significant care team and faces major barriers to engagement and employment. She's interested in gardening and this would be a great opportunity for her. I and her care team would like to be able to offer her something to look forward to once she gets out. And a 24-year-old woman wrote to us and said, I'm very eager to expand my skill set and increase my confidence because this field is one that I enjoy, believe in and am honoured to be of service to. I have found institutional learning difficult to impossible due to mental health challenges. I'm an enthusiastic and dedicated learner, but the rigidity in curriculum, workload and a method of assessment simply doesn't work for my style of learning and engagement. I've learned far more from my time on farms and in gardens than I have from traditional study, and I would always rather be digging and doing than sitting in a classroom under fluorescent lights. Just to sort of pull this back to a slightly bigger picture, this is some research that we did in July 2020, the Pandemic Gardening Survey. Over 9,000 Australians expressed the deep appreciation, meaning and significance that edible gardening held for them, especially during lockdown periods. On the basis of that data and other research, we developed a roadmap to enable a mass expansion of urban agriculture across Australia, with this call for a substantial national fund as its centrepiece. I'd encourage you to read the reports in further details. However, as you can see, we position this as a major investment nationally in preventative health, in addition to many other social, cultural and ecological benefits and impacts that urban food systems can achieve. We believe that there's a strong case for an investment in social prescribing via the use of social bonds to address the health and wellbeing, climate and food security crises that we face. And in terms of how this can really scale up, this is a great book by Michael Abelman, a Canadian farmer living in Vancouver. He's telling the story here of Soul Food Farms, now a network established about 10 years ago, now a network of 4 urban farms managing 5 acres in downtown Vancouver, producing 25 tonnes of fresh produce a year, supplying 30 local restaurants, selling at 5 farmers markets, running a community-supported agriculture program, donating $20,000 worth of produce to community kitchens and employing 25 people, many of whom are experiencing long-term issues with drug addiction, mental health and homelessness. It's an example of a really powerful social enterprise. So in terms of wrapping up and a call to action, my invitation to you is to get involved in the 2nd National Urban Agriculture Month, which we'll be coordinating in November this year. This builds on the Urban Agriculture Forum, which we've run as a national event 3 times since 2016, bringing together over 50 national and international researchers, business owners and community representatives. The first Urban Agriculture Month was held in April last year, had 112 events nationally and over 3,000 participants. This is a celebration of the multiple benefits of edible gardening and urban agriculture and recognition of those who've been working in this sector for several years. But it's also an effort, as I've been attempting to do this morning, to highlight the importance of this work and why it needs to move from a set of activities that are often viewed as niche, marginal and hobby to the centre of a broad-based whole-of-society effort to meet the sustainability, resilience and equity challenges of this decade and beyond. I'll finish at that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. That was amazing to hear about all the risks of food security, but what's happening in our own country here to be able to sort of improve that on urban farming. So next, and that leads very well into Jonathan Cruz here. He's the chef manager here in Clayton Utz, and he's actually got his own urban farming projects set up. He works on the client floor. He's looking at a zero waste kitchen, and he's also on the floor above us, which we can look at after this talk. He's got a veggie patch and a worm farm to go and have a look at about on regenerative farming. So, Jonathan, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name's Jonathan. I'm part of the wonderful catering team here at Clayton Utz. I'm just going to give a quick chat about our little garden project. So the kitchen garden idea is nothing new, and as a chef I would look over magazines and be envious of restaurants in bucolic settings with kitchen gardens, and being in a corporate space I never considered that something like a kitchen garden would be possible. Until I noticed the plant hire people tending to some pot plants on our terrace area. So with a bit of thought as to where the sun would shine and probably not enough thought on where to get water from, I set to work. First step was to seek no approvals, as I knew the idea of soil, compost, mulch, worms, garden tools and heavy lifting in a corporate environment wouldn't even make it to the risk assessment stage before being knocked back. It's a classic case of act first, ask for forgiveness later. Though I haven't yet had to ask for forgiveness, and I think everyone's pretty supportive so far, so fingers crossed. So after finding a guy in Gumtree who was willing to knock up some cut price garden beds, one very quiet Sunday, I smuggled the garden beds up to our outdoor area, filled them with soil, planted an assortment of vegetables and herbs, and I was away. Gardening, too easy. Oop. And there we are. However, turned out there was more to growing produce than just sticking something in the dirt and watering it. The garden very quickly went from lush and leafy to, dead. Feeling a bit of pressure that 6 very large containers of dirt wasn't what was wanted on the terrace, I sought some advice from John Kingston, who runs the Wayside Chapel Rooftop Garden Project. As one of our community partners, John volunteered his time to come and assess our site. He reckoned we could do it and gave a crash course in basic horticulture. Further to this, Dorina Bittner, member of our catering team. Dorina, if you could just stand up and put a face to a name. Quietly modest expert came on board, and with Dorina's expertise and management, the garden came back to life and now produces 30% of the herbs, vegetables and garnishes we use in our cafe. We're still very much in a pilot stage of this project, and I would like to see it expand to provide more produce for our broader catering operation. Though this time I probably will have to seek approval and do one of those really boring business case things, but as I said, I'm quietly confident we'll get it through. One of our sustainability goals is working towards being a zero waste kitchen. We have a long way to go, but as a start, we're focusing on ways to reduce our raw food waste. We keep all our meat trimming and render the fats which we use in cooking. All usable meat and vegetable scrap is turned into stock, or our bone broth, which we serve in meeting rooms as a winter beverage alternative. This is nothing groundbreaking, and in the past this was just a way to run an economical kitchen, but we've taken it further with the introduction of worm farming. All of our non-edible fruit and vegetable scrap goes to our worm farm, which in turn feeds our garden. Currently, we send up to 12 kilo a week of organic waste to our worm farm, which is broken down into worm castings. We do not use any harmful chemicals or fertilisers. We fertilise with our worm castings. We use companion planting to control pests and diseases. We grow plants that attract insects, which creates biodiversity and also aids pest control. The arrival of our very first bee was a very exciting day. And then I believe we attracted another type of bee. Dorina, is this a native bee or a wasp? I thought it was a native bee. Yeah, that was quite exciting because the native bees are actually quite rare and not particularly abundant in the middle of the city. And that is actually from our garden, not like Getty Images, which it does look like. Further to no food waste, we're looking at eliminating single-use items from our operation. And I think this is achievable given some businesses like Ruzi and Returner are recognising the demand and producing reusable food service products. As we see, some are on display down here. And please take a look. Aside from the sustainability aspect, we have noticed that the garden aids employee wellbeing. The space is calming and evolves with the seasons and generates great interest from employees and visitors. I think it's far more pleasing to have a living garden than the usual corporate planter boxes that are generally filled with aggressive, spiky plants that are always dark green and reflect the rigid and sterile cityscape. We would like interested employees to participate in the upkeep of the garden and create something that is part daily working life at CU and ties in with the firm's health and wellbeing initiatives. As mentioned, we really are still in a pilot stage of our project, and I think so much more could be done to increase the amount we grow and reduce and recycle our waste. But if all else, we've turned a space that was lifeless steel and glass into an area that produces food, is biodiverse, is nice to look at and be in. There are so many similar spaces throughout the city. If some new thinking could be applied as to how these spaces are designed and activated with sustainable practices, more opportunities to reduce our carbon footprint will be created. Thank you.
Amazing. All right. Thank you, Jonathan. That was so incredible. I can't wait to go up there and see how it's going. Really great work. So on to Deborah. Deborah and I'll just give a little bit of a blurb here. We had a chat back in February about their global strategy on sustainable gastronomy. And she asked me if any other signatories are doing any work with respect to food and their impact. And I know it's not typically been a focus for CitySwitch, so I'd love to hear if any other signatories in the room have their own programs or policies with respect to food. I do think it's a really important area with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's a really good entry point for engaging your green teams as well. Who doesn't like food? I wanted to just point to a presentation I saw by Pangolin recently. They put food and catering as the 4th biggest category for emissions for an average legal firm. So after electricity for the base and tenancy, and then business flights, food and catering came in as number 4. So it has a really important role in your net zero plans too. On to Deborah to tell you more about their approach to sustainability and food.
Okay. Thanks, Emily. So I'd like to begin today by acknowledging country and the land we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So today I'll be sharing a little bit more about what Swiss Re are doing on our global strategy for sustainable gastronomy, a little bit around the 3 pillars of our strategy, and specifically what we're implementing here in Sydney. And if you want some time for questions, happy to take those as well. So it begins with why. So for us, we've analysed our footprint, and the gastronomy services or the catering is sort of 3rd highest in terms of impact. So following flights and building infrastructure, catering does take up a lot in terms of our footprint. And as a company, we're on a journey to reach net zero by 2030, which is quite an ambitious target. So tackling this topic is really key for us. As an insurance company, we have a mission to make the world more resilient, and that comes down as well to what we're doing in our operations. So looking at catering, we know that there's no sustainable world without sustainable food, and this is taken from Poor and Membek, and this is around why we're tackling this topic. There's also no human well-being without good food, and we've heard from some of the other signatories around why this is important, and particularly here in Australia, that connection to culture. For us as a company, Swiss Re, we want to walk the talk, obviously around net zero, but also changing the hearts and minds of our employees. And we recognise this as both a challenge and an opportunity. So these are the reasons why we're tackling the topic. There are 3 pillars to our strategy. And in 2019, we produced a white paper. And the 3 pillars that feature in that white paper are our path to zero waste, our path to net zero emissions, and then also tackling resilient food systems. And when we look at our footprint as a company, we have all sorts of operations. In Switzerland, we have full hospitality kitchens like you see here at Clayton Utz, right through to our operations in Australia where we order in our catering. But we want to look at the whole footprint and tackle that holistically. So we conducted a status quo analysis, and we looked at things we were already doing really well and we wanted to continue and do more of. But then also in other operations, what else can we do to bring all locations to the same level of sustainable practices? So the first pillar we looked at was around zero waste and going from getting rid of disposables where we could. So looking to circular systems, and I think Ali's going to share more on that with you today. So in operations where we weren't already using reusable cups in our pantry areas, we looked to change those. And then where it wasn't possible, we introduced biodegradable materials so that they could go into the organic bins. Also considering the zero food waste. In our hospitality kitchens, we looked to prevent the food waste completely. Planning out our events and also providing our guests with some smaller plates, but also allowing for refills so that we were eliminating that. And then we made use of leftover food. So we would sell the leftover food to employees or give it to external organisations. And here in Sydney, we work with Oz Harvest. So the next pillar I wanted to share on is our path to net zero emissions. And here we were offering more attractive plant-based food. We were also offering different animal products, so shifting in favour of more plant-based foods and a less carbon-intensive animal product, so the nose to tail, and also using second cuts. And then looking closely at providing local and seasonal products, and then educating our employees around why we were doing this as well. And the final pillar is our path to resilient food systems. And up the top, you can see this was a partnership form that we've created so that before we start working with any new vendor, we check that their values align with ours. And then these are some of the vendors that we're already working with here in Sydney. And I think Darcy from Kua Coffee will be sharing more with you, so I won't steal any of his messaging. So under this resilient food systems, we look for the local partners that have a local positive impact. Then we also work with partners that really foster biodiversity and they align with what we're trying to achieve. And then we work with partners that are treating the animals but also people really well. And some of those key questions is would you take your guest here and would you personally want to work there? So on to a little bit around what we've implemented so far. And this was during the height of the pandemic. When we brought our staff back to the office, one thing we thought might be fun was to have a carbon positive beer. So we decided to work with 4 Pints and we switched out our beer brand. This has had a really been well received. We've also introduced a new waste stream, and that's the return and earn. And I think having this in place where any of the proceeds are donated to charity has helped our staff to cooperate with the effort. And all of the proceeds are going to our charity of the year, which is CareFlight. Some of the other things we've done is really looked at the biggest impact of things, and for our catering services, that is the coffee, but also the milk. So we've introduced almond and oat milk, and that's been enjoyed in our offices. We are also working with vendors who can deliver the catering on foot, but also on reusable platters so that we're not creating waste from those services. So I'd like to leave you all today with some key takeaways for implementation. So zero waste, net zero emissions and resilient food systems, these are related but certainly different perspectives, and we need to consider all of them when we tackle this topic. As a company, we're on a path to achieving net zero. There are some things that we all can do now, and we just make a start today on what we can. There are some things that we can do on our own, and then for others, we need like-minded partners. For us, this is a continuing journey. We don't have all the answers yet. We haven't yet arrived, but we are experimenting. And the key to our success will be to have partners in this journey. So just encourage you all today to see what you can do in your operations to tackle this topic as well. With that, I might hand back to Emily unless there are any questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. That was amazing. And yeah, please go and have a chat to Deborah during morning tea if you do have questions, and push her for some of those details on how she achieved all of this. Our next speaker is Darcy. Darcy Small, one of the founders of the social enterprise Kua. Kua has come up with a zero-waste solution to coffee, lending coffee beans to local businesses and taking back the coffee grounds for reuse. The City of Sydney supported their journey with 2 environmental performance innovation grants. These grants help Sydney-siders test a new technology or process that can benefit the green and circular economy and isn't already being used locally. So over to Darcy to tell you a bit more about Kua.
Hi everyone. Who had a coffee this morning? And then keep your hand up. So hands up if you had a coffee this morning, and then keep your hand up if it was one from the back. Okay, so there are some experimenters because we had it in the weird chemical jugs. I like the chemical jugs because they help you taste the flavours. So if you want to have one afterwards, there's a little card that tells you that it tastes like hazelnuts and blueberry and maybe some chocolate. But we do it in push button machines and espressos. It can be enjoyed in all sorts. But I'm not here to talk about the flavour so much. I'm here to talk about the environmental impact and the social impact. So of those who had a coffee this morning, who knows where that coffee came from? At the back, Uganda. Does anyone else know the country? Maybe they didn't drink a coffee from us, but they know the country that it came from? Okay, I think that's crazy, and that's pretty much one of the big reasons that we exist, because coffee just looks like a black liquid, and it doesn't matter if it comes from Uganda or Peru or Byron Bay, it all looks exactly the same, and that means that a lot of things can be hidden in the supply chain. But we didn't know any of that until we all moved into a share house, and the way I'll speak is I think I've got 15 photos, and that tells a little bit of our startup story, and mainly how we've learned to communicate about what we do. Particularly, I'm interested in how we can engage employees, I think, for this talk. But it's funny because when we applied for the City of Sydney grant, they didn't know that we wrote it in our living room. There were 6 of us working on a startup. And I have to say thank you to the City of Sydney for taking a chance on us, because who knows? We literally wrote a grant application saying we're going to deliver coffee in buckets and it's going to be the next big thing. And they said, go for it. And that was great. But yeah, I had no idea I was going to end up in a startup in a share house selling coffee when I was growing up. I was lucky enough to grow up here, which is Crescent Head. I actually went back this weekend and it was a wonderful weekend until my friend tore his MCL 2 hours in and we had to come back to the hospital. So that was a bugger. But yeah, I grew up here, and growing up in an area like this, I think you learn to appreciate the natural environment. So then when I graduated and moved to Sydney, I wanted to study something to do with sustainability. And for me, that ended up being solar panels. So I became a solar panel engineer, and that was the career path I was going to take. But at the end of my degree, they sent a bunch of us to Uganda, and it was one of those weird trips where they're like, we'll send you over there and see what happens. And it was one of those volunteerism things that aren't particularly good, because you know, someone that grew up in Crescent Head doesn't really understand the Ugandan context and therefore can't create much impact. So we spent a month trying to work out what productive things were going to come out of this trip. And luckily, this guy on the right called Daniel saved us, because Daniel knew how we could create impact. Has anyone spent more than $5 for a latte recently? Yeah, I spent $7 the other day. It was crazy. But back when we had this trip, like $5 was about the max. But for Daniel, $5 still seemed insane because he was getting less than $5 per kilo of coffee. So he's come from a family of coffee farmers that live here. This is called Mount Elgon. It's has one of the highest concentrations of smallholder coffee farmers in the world, which means they're on less than like half an acre of land. But he was the first of 3 generations of coffee farmers to stop growing coffee. And the reason for that was because it was no longer profitable for him and he'd moved on to something else. And we thought, hang on a second, we understood a little bit about why it wasn't profitable, and we realised that if we could connect them to a market that was paying $5 or $6 or $7 for a latte, maybe we could create an impact out of that university trip. So we made a deal, and the deal was to smuggle some coffee back with us to Sydney, and we put a kilo in 6 different bags to make sure it got through the airport, and all 6 of them got through. The reason that all 6 got through is because 98% of Australia's coffee comes from overseas because we don't have the growing conditions. So all coffee comes in because Australia's the coffee capital of the world. And we weren't sure what this coffee was going to taste like. We weren't big coffee nerds, so we took it to all these roasters. And they said one by one that you'd stumbled on some of the world's best coffee. And based on that deal, we had no choice but to start a social enterprise. And like all good startups, the first step was to move into a share house together. There was a rule, no coffee talk after 8 p.m, but that was broken very frequently. It's called Kua because Kua means to grow in Swahili, and Swahili is a language that connects people in Uganda to neighbouring countries. And yeah, we set it up with the vision to basically sell it to workplaces and give all the profits back to Uganda, and then that would tackle that economic inequality thing that we'd learnt about. But as we researched a little bit more about how coffee was done here, there was another big stat that we learned, and that was for all 10 cups of coffee that are drunk in Sydney or in Melbourne, 9 of those cups, the coffee waste goes to landfill, which we also thought was crazy because coffee waste is really good in body scrubs or mushroom farming or compost. So at that point, we pitched to the City of Sydney and said, we're going to deliver in buckets to workplaces. All of the coffee grounds will go to local community gardens, and all of the profits will go back to Mount Elgon. And then the farmers actually use the profits to plant native trees, which mitigates some of the risks of climate change and then offsets our emissions at 200%. And so we started selling. We had done a few internships, so we quit the internships and convinced our boss to buy coffee. And after 5 friendly workplaces signed on, we started to get more real clients and learn a little bit about how to run a business, which was exciting. And I've forgotten, hang on, I can see the next slide. We're getting close to the end. Okay, so we're selling coffee in buckets. Okay, that's where we're up to. And we have 30 clients on Swiss Re, PwC, Canva, a lot of big names. So we're really excited about that. And as part of the City of Sydney grant, a huge component of that is evaluation. And it's really good that we actually did the evaluation because we were so proud of our impact. We diverted, I think, 3 tons of coffee grounds from landfill. Now we're at about 10 tons per year. We'd worked with 75 farming families. Together, they had regenerated about 150 hectares of overcultivated land. Emissions, which is 10 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilo of coffee, were being offset at 200%, and so we're categorising all that impact. But the number that we're most excited by was the 2,500 employees who were drinking our coffee in the office. Because we're like, the thing about coffee is that when you have coffee, you have a moment, and it's a real cultural ritual for us here. If that coffee is different and people can understand about all this impact and all these numbers, then they can maybe apply that to other areas of their life and become a more sustainable consumer. And I think everyone here thinks that that's a big reason that you would adopt something like this. So we ran some interviews. This is a photo of us. Oh, where's my interview photo? Oh, I've missed it. Okay, it's okay. It was a bad photo anyway. But we ran 50 focus group interviews, and we did such a good job of it. But we learned that of the 50, less than 5 knew anything about who we were. Some remembered our name. Some remembered that it came from Uganda, but that was like the top 5. And the rest of the people didn't even know that their workplace had switched to coffee. So for us, we're creating direct impact, but our systemic impact had failed, which was motivating us to keep going. And we were saved by one of those interviewees. And they said, oh, I know exactly what you do. You help me answer two questions. Where does your coffee come from? And where does your coffee end up? Where does my coffee come from? Uganda. Where does my coffee end up? Goes to community gardens. And from those two questions, I can also dig deeper and understand the other layers of impact that you've built into your business model. And previous to that, probably because I'm a solar engineer, I'd been adopting and talking about all the principles of the circular economy. Then I learned about the donut economy, so I threw some buzzwords in over there. Then I saw that what we were doing was reverse logistics. So it was just layer upon layer of jargon, and no one understood anything except when you distilled it to these two questions. Where does my coffee come from? There's that photo. That's the photo of the... where does my coffee come from? And where does my coffee end up? Suddenly the consumer was an active participant in our business model and then able to apply those questions to other areas of their consumption. And that's when we move from just direct impact to systemic impact. So my message, I guess, is to consider when adopting sustainable practices, how do we engage the people who are using them, and then get them to think about where else that can be applied. And then we're having a much broader impact than just drinking a cup of coffee. Thank you.
Promise you'll be eating it, having more coffee, Darcy's coffee and the food soon. So thank you to all the speakers for talking about how the role of business in sustainable food systems and what you're doing. But I thought there's really 30% of our signatories were talking last year on the report. We're talking about trying to do something around waste, food side and the and we've discussed that in detail, but a lot also is around the foodware side of things, and we've touched on that. Deborah was chatting about that before, and so I just really want to talk about it. That's the business side. It's really about the policy side as well, just to understand how it's coming from both angles here. I'm just going to look at my notes. So yes, that's what I really want to talk about quickly. I know it's a bit of a dry one, but I promise I'll be quick. So at a national level, in 2019, the National Waste Policy Action Plan was designed. And this was to implement the 2018 National Waste Policy by a number of key targets and actions to guide investment and national efforts to 2030 and beyond. So the national targets measured against the 2018 National Waste Report are to ban the export of waste, plastic, paper and glass tyres, commencing really from, already in commence, to reduce the total waste generated in Australia by 10% per person by 2030, 80% of the average recovery rate from all waste streams by 2030, halve the amount of organic waste sent to landfill by 2030, and significantly increase the use of recycled content by governments and industry, and make comprehensive and economy-wide and timely data available to yourselves to sort of start really sort of making some innovations. And finally, phase out problematic and unnecessary plastics by 2025. So this policy is really about trying to sort of get you to think about waste, not as waste that's destined for landfill, but really about, it's a resource. And, we need to actually sort of think about how we can turn it from a linear to a circular economy in these kind of ways. And we've heard some amazing talks about that today. And these circular economy principles for waste are: 1, to avoid waste where we can, to improve the resource recovery, to increase the use of recycled material and build demand and markets for recycled products, to better manage that flow to benefit human health and the environment and the economy. And 5th point is really to improve information to support innovation, guide investment, and enable that consumer decisions. So we're trying to make sure, the CitySwitch is one of those. We're trying to sort of create that network and be able to collaborate and share ideas and be able to sort of get you onto the path of trying to reduce your waste. So sort of moving a bit sort of further down towards, they came up really in 2021, the federal, state and territory ministers identified 8 problematic and unnecessary plastic product types in the industry to phase out by 2025. And this came under the National Waste Policy Action Plan, which led to the creation of the National Plastics Plan 2021, which has now been adopted by our states and territories. And it's been adopted in a slightly different way depending on the state. So you can see the green one is what's actually already banned, and the blue one is what's being banned within the next 2 years. But hopefully you understand that, we're doing what we can innovation-wise, but it's going to be hopefully happening at a policy level as well, at government level. So, I'd say South Australia actually is leading the way by banning a lot of the items, but New South Wales is firmly on its way. And that lightweight bags, the 35 micron bag was banned at the 1st of June this month. And by the end of this year, we'll also have straws and stirrers, cutlery, and expanded polystyrene food and drinks containers, and also cotton wool buds and microbeads. There's also microbeads going to be at the end of this year as well. So, because the problem is, I guess, the reason that, and this doesn't also just cover plastic, this also covers a lot of the sort of bioplastic compostables, because plasticized plant material, unfortunately, when it ends up in the marine environment, still ends up behaves like plastic. It only really, if we only have a sensible waste stream for it and it can be contained, that's fine, but it doesn't. So, plastic is doing exactly what we designed it to do. It's a revolutionary material, but only if we can sort of keep it within that circular type system. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So in New South Wales, one of the reasons that this has all come about is because single-use plastic items and packaging makes up about 60% of all litter in New South Wales. But the ban that's coming into place will prevent about 2.7 billion items of plastic littering in New South Wales over the next 20 years. And as I said before, just to sort of recap, it's not just plastic, what we think of plastic, it's all the compostables, even in Australian certified compostable plastics, bioplastics, degradable plastics. And that's for the reasons that I said. So we're trying to look at alternatives again, like swap systems, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail, because unless we have these industrial composting facilities available, which unfortunately we really don't yet, and it's how to capture it and separate it at source. It's just, even though it is compostable, it's not, we're just not able to actually treat it that way, and it's just ending up in a hole in the ground. So the ban, who does it apply to? So the ban applies to everyone: businesses, organisations, consumers. Consumers will no longer be able to receive the banned items by the 35 micron bags from now, and then, as I said, the other ones by the end of November. But it also applies to anyone who supplies a prohibited item in New South Wales while carrying on a business. So that includes sort of commercial purposes like retail, hospitality, manufacturers, suppliers. But it also applies to anyone who's supplying a prohibited item while carrying on an activity, whether that be a charity event, a sporting event, also fundraisers. So actually marketing and branding as well, that also applies. And so that's where I think, that's something that probably yourselves in the room, some of you will probably be doing that, and you need to sort of be aware of how the ban affects us all. So the circular economy provides us that framework to redesign and our production and consumption of these systems moving forwards towards a zero waste economy. So luckily, there's already some great innovative solutions out there for industry to help us reuse. And we've, Swiss Re were talking about they're already using Returner, and Clayton Utz, I think, are exploring some of the solutions as well. And really, these other solutions are really helping us look at reuse and using as little as material as possible within our circular economy. So, 2 solutions, and unfortunately I haven't got Ruzi with me, but I will send you out all the details. We've got circular container systems for offices. So Returner is one here. That's a foodware where they actually have a stock of items that you can use and just go out into the cafes outside, or you can have it as an internal one if you have somebody like Jonathan, who actually looks after and provides food in-house. Replated is a local, so Returner are a Melbourne-based company. Returner is a more local one for Sydney. Replated, they're a reusable and swappable takeaway system as well, and B Corp. We've got swap cup systems. A lot of you hopefully have talked to the other and listened to one of our other talks recently, and we've got sort of green caffeine, clay cups. Returner again do a swap cup system, and that's more one that you can go to your cafe. So it's a membership-based program where you can go and just order your coffee as per normal, and then, you know, just sign out the coffee cup to you, a bit like you would do with your normal keep cups, as everyone calls them, and then take it to your cafe, and then you return it back to the cafe at a later stage. And then there are event solutions. So Ruzi, who's a North Sydney and a signatory of my other program that I look after, he has a wine goblet type set, or a coffee cup and foodware. So he will able to provide that for your event, and then you're able to actually use that, and then just put them into a tray, and then he'll take it away and rewash it and wash it for you. So you're having to do away with a lot of the administration type thing. And he also, if it's depending on the size of the event, he can also take away all your food waste. So he can help you plan to make sure that he can take away all food waste and food scraps as well, and process that off-site as well, which is a good solution. And Globlet is another beverage type option. So I'll send those links all through to you, so you've got some good ideas to have a look at. But I guess the key action really for all of these is to really understand at your level what's the biggest impact that you need to look at. Is it food waste? Is it foodware? Coffee. So you need to really be understand what's going in your bins. The old phrase, if it's not measured, you can't manage it. So you need to be able to sort of, and we've got some great resources on our website about how to measure your waste and identify what is really going into your bins. And then looking at how to implement an organics waste stream. We've got Jonathan here to be able to talk to you at that level, and Swissary. And then look at reusable swap cup type systems, trying to introduce those into your organisation. So, again, I'd love to thank all of our speakers here today and yourselves for coming. And we want to encourage you all to stay to have sample some of the sustainable foods that we've got. Thank you, Clayton Utz. Yeah. Yeah. I can do talks on that, depending on where we are, depending on where it is, because obviously you've got my colleague here, Emily, for the City of Sydney, and I tend to typically look after. We can do it online, we can do it face-to-face, absolutely. Yeah, the whole point of CitySwitch really is to be able to encourage innovation and collaboration and sharing of ideas. We need to transition over to circular economy as quickly as possible. However, that's that's why we're all in this network, and it's great. I just love all the stories. Every time we host one of these, it's inspiring really about all the work you're doing. So yes, absolutely. So please, just put hands together to say thank you to everyone today, and then take everyone's right. Thanks. Welcome.